we are recording. So everyone, thanks so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. We have our special guest who just came fresh off the White House press briefing, Jonathan Karl. So Jonathan Karl has been the chief White House correspondent for ABC News since 2012. He's reported at the White House on and off for 2 decades, covered Capitol Hill, the Pentagon, State Department. Prior to working for ABC, he was working for CNN, the New York Post, and the New Republic. And you've reported on every presidential campaign since 1996. A graduate of Vassar College, and you live in Northern Virginia with your wife and 2 daughters. So Jonathan, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I wanted to start with you explaining kind of what we just got from the press briefing. What stood out to you, and is this a typical day for you at the White House?
Yeah, it's hard. There's really no typical days in Trump world, but I got to be honest. The press briefings have become pretty frustrating. There's they seem to be resembling more like a campaign press conference as opposed to a White House press briefing. You know, I still firmly believe in the notion that the White House press secretary is a public servant. His salary is paid by the taxpayers, and certainly, you know, is hired by and works for the president at the pleasure of the president. But this is not, shouldn't be a purely political exercise, and of late they've looked more and more like purely political exercises.
Yeah, it seems like to me that much of the press conference, what I observed was that we have the press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany. She was sort of just saying how the press is getting it wrong and how the Trump campaign isn't stoking racial divisions. They're just trying to unify the country. Were you surprised by that answer from her, or was that kind of expected?
I mean, unfortunately, I'm not surprised, but it is a little bit maddening. I mean, the president had this tweet this morning on Bubba Wallace, which really was alarming in a number of ways. I mean, he's basically saying Bubba Wallace should apologize for the fact that the investigation turned out that noose had been in his garage long before the garage was assigned to him, and therefore didn't appear to be something that was targeting him. I don't know what Bubba Wallace would have to apologize for. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And we tried to get an answer from her on that. She did not give an answer. And then in that same tweet, he says that NASCAR's ratings are the lowest ever because of that and the flag decision. So, you know, he seemed to be pretty clearly saying that the decision to ban the Confederate flag was something that that NASCAR did that contributed to ratings downturn, which, by the way, NASCAR's ratings have been for 10 years kind of trending down, but they're actually not down now. So I don't know what he's referring to. They actually, this last weekend with, NASCAR race and an IndyCar race were up. So I don't even know what the hell he's talking about, but McEnany just refused to answer that question and kept on accusing the journalists in that room of taking the president out of context. But she would not even, I mean, I just asked her finally directly, so what is the president's position? Does he think it was a mistake that NASCAR banned the Confederate flag? And she wouldn't say. Somebody else asked the reverse, which is, well, why doesn't he praise it? Why doesn't he praise the decision? A flag that, you know, on one hand could represent a treasonous act against the United States, on the other hand, represents slavery and the institution of slavery. And so why wouldn't he? I mean, forget whether or not he wants to criticize the decision. Why doesn't he praise the decision? And again, she didn't want to engage on that.
Yeah, so when you talk about NASCAR, you talk about him kind of getting the numbers wrong for the ratings. It kind of reminds me of what stood out to me about the coronavirus and how I guess McEnany was questioned about some data points that Trump has given out recently. Can you talk a little bit more about those?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's another one of the things that the president, said over the weekend was that, 99% of the coronavirus cases are harmless, which is, I mean, it's just wrong. And she's tried to explain it away, but I mean, she's pointed to the declining mortality rate, but again, she doesn't really have an answer to that. I mean, it's got to be a very difficult job to be the White House press secretary and have to answer and defend things that in some cases are rather indefensible. But what's different with her is, I mean, more. I guess we saw a little bit of this. We certainly saw some of it with Sean Spicer. We saw some of it with Sarah Sanders. Obviously, Stephanie Grisham never held a single press briefing, so we can't say. But this notion of turning the questions into a reason to attack the press instead of answer the questions is kind of the modus operandi for this press secretary.
Yeah, it seems like even though it's hard to not mention, but obviously your book came out before the coronavirus and came out before all the protests for George Floyd. But I mean, the characters are kind of the same. Is that right? In terms of like press secretary wise, they're just kind of doing the same kind of job. Would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote the book. I wanted to write because I wanted to really explain what it was like to be a journalist covering this White House, covering a president who has essentially declared war on the press, but at the same time cares more about our work than any other president that I've dealt with. This is my fourth president covering. He consumes more news media. He watches all of the cable television stations. He's got his DVR lined up, and he watches Fox, but he's also, trust me, he's watching a lot of CNN, and he's watching a lot of MSNBC. He watches a lot of ABC News, trust me, because I've heard from him. I've gotten calls from him. I've gotten, critical tweets from him for stories that I've done. So on the one hand, a president who has declared war on the press, but also cares more about what the press is saying than really any other president. So that's why it's been an extraordinary story. And my book landed just as the country was shutting down with coronavirus, and the president was starting those coronavirus task force briefings. And I got to say, it felt more relevant what I wrote than if it had come out before all of that. I mean, it's like this was the culmination of the Trump show, attack the press, court the press, make the story all about you, shade the truth, say things that are flatly untrue, anything you can do to promote yourself. And, what I call the Trump show, not because that's how I see it, but that's the way he sees this. He sees his presidency as the world's greatest reality television show, and anything he can do to boost the ratings of that show, literally, to get better reviews for that show, to get more people paying attention and caring about that show, and to make its star look better is paramount.
I'm glad you brought up the White House coronavirus task force briefings. There's been a lot of debate on whether or not cable news stations should carry that live. I mean, because you said it's become kind of a political rally for him. So what's your answer to people who are concerned that you guys are just kind of, the media is kind of promoting his, giving him more press, just promoting his real life?
Well, I think it's on one hand a totally legitimate concern, and those are decisions that certainly are not mine. But if I were running a cable news channel, I don't think I would have blocked out my shows to have unfiltered, presidential, briefings day to day, like some of them were. Although I think that if you look at it, Fox was carrying those briefings from beginning to end, even when they were 2 hours long. But the others were not. They were for a while, and then they stopped. And certainly the broadcast networks like ABC and CBS, NBC were not. Now that said, if there's like a major development, there were a couple of points along the line over the course of the pandemic where you had major, like, earth-shattering developments. It's important to go in and carry it live to see what the news is. But when the president is using it as a way to just kind of say, I'm doing all the great, everything I'm doing is great, everything is wonderful, don't believe what you're actually seeing, just believe me. You know, I don't think there's much of a value in carrying that. Now, that said, we live in a very different world, as you know, Jordan. I mean, if people want to watch those briefings, they'll watch those briefings. They can watch them on Twitter. You can watch them live on Twitter. You know, every major network has got its own streaming channels. You can watch digitally online. So it's not like the president's briefings aren't going to come out. You know, I mean, people can watch this stuff and will watch it.
So you've been in the White House press briefings for different presidents. Can you talk a little bit more about how this one is different? The sense I got from your book is that this, as soon as the president became president, the briefings changed a bit. Can you talk more about that? How so?
Yeah, I mean, it's they've changed dramatically. I think that you know, there's a natural tension between a reporter and a press secretary, especially a White House reporter and a White House press secretary. It's an adversarial relationship in many ways. You know, our job is to get, you know, is to seek the truth, get the facts without fear or favor, and get beyond the spin of whatever the White House Communications Office is trying to put out, and ask questions that they would rather avoid. But I think that by and large, in previous White Houses, never perfect, trust me, major complaints. My predecessors as the president of the White House Correspondents Association had many clashes with press secretaries under Clinton, Bush, and Obama, which would be the three that I have experience with. But you know, there was a sense with press secretaries that they had a job beyond just being the president's you know, hatchet man or hatchet woman. That the press secretaries had a responsibility to advocate within the administration for more openness and really understanding that there is a sacred obligation to tell the truth as White House press secretary. Now, it's never good to lie, no matter who you are, what you're doing, but particularly if you're speaking on behalf of the executive branch of the United States government, if you're speaking on behalf of the West Wing, the president, you can't, you know, you may go and try to put everything in the best light, but you can't go out there and say things that are flatly untrue. And we've seen that over and over and over again with this White House, unfortunately. You know, I remember I had it seems so quaint now, I had a really tense exchange with Jay Carney when he was White House press secretary. I'm talking about off camera. Carney, actually, a little bit was on camera, and then the argument got more heated afterwards. But this was when things were heating up with Syria, and you know, Obama had drawn his red line on chemical weapons, and he said something which just I thought misrepresented the truth about Assad. Now, Assad is a murderous, you know, genocidal, you know, dictator, you know. So, but even so, Carney said that Assad had admitted that he had chemical weapons. This was at a time when he was not admitting it. So I said, how can you say that? What are you basing that on? Saying he's admitted it. And we had a little exchange, and then I said, well, let me know. He said, I'll show you. And then after the briefing was over, he sent me a quote from an interview that Assad had done on CBS. I think it was with Charlie Rose, actually, but it was CBS. And in the interview, Assad refused to confirm or deny that he had chemical weapons. He said, I can't answer that question because it's a matter of, you know, national security, so I won't tell you whether or not I have them. Well, that's different than saying that he admitted it. So I was like yelling at Jay over the phone, you're the White House press secretary. How, you know, even if you're talking about Assad, you need to tell the truth. And he was like, he kind of acknowledged that maybe he should have characterized it differently, and he should have said refused to deny, and we kind of, had an agreement. But I mean, that stood out because he was saying something that was not true, and it was really unusual. Now, Jay and I had, and every other press secretary, I had disagreements with that, all of them, but it's like, even if you're going to be sparring with the press, you need to tell the truth. With this White House, I mean, my Lord.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I noticed that with certain press secretaries, I think with you specifically, when it came to Sean Spicer, you asked him a question about telling the truth from the podium.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how that went down?
Yeah, that was, and I described this, including some stuff I'd never talked about in the book that happened after that. It was, Sean famously did that briefing. I won't call it a press conference because he didn't take questions, but that his very first briefing about how the biggest inaugural crowd ever, period, and he said three things in the course of that were completely and totally and verifiably false. Three things. So I thought that was a little outrageous, and especially on his first day at the podium. So when he came back and that was on a Saturday, when he came back and held a briefing on Monday, which was the first one where he took questions, I said, before I get to my, question on the news of the day, Sean, a question about your job. Do you promise that you will always tell the truth to the best of your ability from that podium? And he answered to me, yes, and went on a little bit, which was good. Took that as a good sign. But Sean, in the following day, came enraged that I had the nerve to ask him that question, as if implying that he would ever say anything that was unknowingly untrue. And it immediately, I had known Sean for years. That single question, me asking him if he would tell the truth, in his mind, destroyed our relationship. And there are a lot of behind the scenes things that grew from that. What's funny is I had asked almost exactly the same question of Josh Earnest when he became press secretary under Obama, and Josh had no such reaction. Later, I asked it of Anthony Scaramucci. So I think it's a good question. In hindsight, I think every press secretary should be asked that, at the start.
I'm glad you brought up Anthony Scaramucci, because I was surprised he made it in your book, since he was only there for a short amount of time. But another character surprised me even more, Kanye West. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And I think he's relevant today, is he not?
Yeah, Kanye, yeah. Well, I was in the Oval Office when Kanye met with President Trump, and it was the most surreal experience I've ever had in a White House, any White House, even the Trump White House. And I described it in detail. We all remember seeing what played out on camera, and I was standing right next to the president because we were all jammed in around his desk. And I have some photos, one of which I put in the book, that I was taking at the time. If you look at the video, you notice I'm taking notes on my phone, but I'm also snapping up pictures. And at one point, Trump brings me into the conversation with Kanye, because Kanye is leaning over the Resolute and banging on it. You can see, by the way, the Secret Service is getting nervous, clearly getting nervous. Oh my God, what's going on here? At one point, Kanye walks around the desk and goes over to give Trump a hug, and I could see the Secret Service kind of on the the balls of their feet, what's happening here? But at one point, Kanye West is talking about how they should get rid of Air Force One and replace it with an Apple plane, an I-plane. Superfly I-plane is what he called it. And Trump turns to me in the middle of this with all the cameras going and says, "What? You think we should get rid of Air Force One? You don't think that's a good idea, do you?" And it's just so absurd. When it was all over, by the way, in that moment, I did ask some questions. I asked Kanye West basically if he thought, Trump was a racist. I mean, Kanye West thought George W. Bush was a racist. He famously said it on NBC, and he went after Taylor Swift, obviously. I mean, well, what about this guy, basically, is what I was saying. And he gave me a long, meandering question that didn't really answer it. And I asked him again. I was like, wait a minute, but what do you say to those who say he is a racist? And he's like, and he gave me this answer, and it was just so bizarre. He said, no, you only get one question. I am complex. I am like a fine wine. I am like four-dimensional chess in Minority Report. You have to, and he went into this whole thing. But at the end of it, the most surprising thing happened as we were being escorted out of the Oval Office. I went over to say one more thing to him. Cameras stopped rolling. And he said, oh, come on, man. And he gave me a hug. So I got a hug from Kanye West in the Oval Office, which was I just didn't know how to process it all.
Why did you include that in your book? Was it like some comic relief, or do you think it's relevant to the whole theme of the book?
I mean, I think it got to the notion of the Trump show and how Trump wants to keep everybody riveted, attention drawn. I describe in the book how the event was actually supposed to be a private lunch, and I had been told by Sarah Sanders, no, there will be no press coverage, none of that. And at that morning, I had been I was the poll reporter that day, so I was in the Oval Office when Trump had a bill signing, and at the end of it, I was like, well, one more question, can we come in when you see Kanye? And he's like, yeah. And I see this, this look from Sarah Sanders like this. So look, it wasn't a serious, event, but I thought it conveyed some of the insanity of the way things were, particularly in that first year of the Trump presidency. And I also noticed John Kelly in the office, in the Oval Office. And, John Kelly had really tried to impose order on the West Wing and control who was coming in and out of the Oval Office to meet with the president. And this showed that Kelly that was out of his control. I mean, this was a pure Trump event. This is nothing about White House agenda. Technically they talked a little bit about criminal justice reform, but this was Trump holding court, basically.
So you talk about seeing Kanye West in the Oval kind of as surreal. Can you talk, from your book, I got that the whole presidency of Donald Trump is surreal for you. Can you talk a little bit more about that and why?
Well, it's just, it's so unlike my experience covering. I first walked into this White House. Mike McCurry was the press secretary. Bill Clinton was the president. It was a really crazy time because it was in the aftermath of the Monica Lewinsky story, and it was going into impeachment. So it wasn't like this was a particularly normal White House at that point. But that experience, I was in here on and off with George W. Bush, and I spent the entirety of Barack Obama's second term as the chief White House correspondent for ABC. So I have a vantage point of how other White Houses have worked, and this one is just so qualitatively different. And you become clear that the reason is because in this case, you have a president who also acts as his own press secretary, his own communications director, his own chief of staff, his own national security advisor. I mean, he does it all. And the others kind of scramble to keep up. And it has made for some unusual days here. I don't think we'll ever see a presidency quite like this again. I really don't.
Yeah, when I first started reading your book, I got sucked in. I read the preview first and ordered it because you were talking about how you first met Mr. Trump. I mean,
yeah.
You sound like someone who didn't want to cover celebrity, but here you are covering a celebrity president.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to cover politics from the start. I mean, probably like you. I mean, I just wanted to, and the one job that I could get, the first daily newspaper job I could get was at the New York Post. And I was assigned as a general assignment reporter. That's how it was. And but I really wanted to cover City Hall. I wanted to cover New York politics and eventually national politics. And I ended up cold calling Donald Trump one day because there was no way. I had worked my way to be like the number three person for the post at City Hall. You know, I was the very junior person at City Hall. But Michael Jackson had just gotten married to Lisa Marie Presley in secret. So this is the world's biggest pop star, just married Elvis Presley's daughter. And nobody had seen the couple yet. And it turned out they were staying at Trump Tower. So on a total whim, I didn't know Donald Trump from Adam. On a total whim, I just called up the general number at Trump Tower and Trump Organization, and asked for Donald Trump. And sure enough, I got him on the phone. And I said, I want to do a story about why the most famous newlyweds in the world decided to have their honeymoon at Trump Tower. And he's like, come over. And within like less than an hour, there I was running around Trump Tower with Donald Trump doing a celebrity story. Again, it was, you know what it is when you're first starting working for the paper, you want to get in the paper, whatever it takes. And that got me the front page and like 5 stories inside. And like, it was this big thing. And then, Trump was somebody I could always, from that point on, 1994, was somebody I could call up and get a quote, or I could always get through to him, always.
So how have you changed at all from then till now? I mean, are there some similarities and some differences you see?
I don't think he's changed much at all. Certainly his priorities are the same. Back then his priorities were to be the middle of the story, to be on the front page of the newspaper, to be in the news, and to be portrayed as the greatest. And anything he could do, and if it meant exaggerating, if it meant shading the truth, not telling the truth, fine. But the stakes are so different. So I describe at the end of the book a meeting. Again, this is one I had never talked about before the book, where I got summoned to the Oval Office just this past fall because the president was mad at me about a story I had done. And I ended up spending nearly an hour in the Oval Office with him, sitting across from the Resolute in this crazy meeting that meandered over like 15 different subjects. And I mean, to put it in context, North Korea was a Monday, it was a Tuesday, over the weekend, it was over Labor Day weekend. North Korea had launched missiles for the first time in a while. We were just after the shootings in El Paso and Dayton. There was a hurricane bearing down on Florida, Category 5. I mean, it was a day where I would assume the president would be extremely busy. And here he is, like, spending nearly an hour with me. And I remember sitting there across from the Resolute desk, and I'm thinking, and I kept on thinking back to 1994. And I'm like, could I have ever imagined, first of all, that I would be here, this, 25, almost 26 years later, and that he would be there? No way. But I was looking at him, I was thinking, I was like, this is the same guy, but instead of talking about how cool the condominiums are in Trump Tower and why Michael and Lisa Marie would want to be there, he's talking matters of life or death for the whole nation. I mean, the stakes are entirely different, but he's the same guy. I have a photograph, it's in the book, from that 1994 meeting, and I had lost the photo. It was in a box of pictures that I had put in my basement after I moved from New York down to DC. And after he got elected president, I went out and found it. And I look at that photo now, and he looks the same. It's like the same dark suit, the same red tie, the same hair, the same grin that he has with 1,000 pictures he takes now, except he's at the White House. But again, the circumstances are entirely different.
Before our audience at home, I believe this is the picture that you're referring to.
Oh yeah, there you go. Oh my God.
So I guess tell me more about your book. I mean, from what I get from it, it talks a lot about how the press should operate, whereas there's a fine line between defending ourselves as truth tellers and being the opposition party. Can you talk a little bit more about why that's important to write about and what the opposition party is?
Yeah, I mean, what I think that we we journalists tend to be, I think a lot of people get into this business. First of all, it's intellectually stimulating and rewarding, but a lot of people get into journalism because they want to make the world a better place. We're to a certain extent idealists. But I think the one way you make the world a better place is you strive to ferret out accurate information and to expose things that people in power would otherwise like not to be exposed. But that we should never take sides. We're not partisans. We are not, I think we failed if we act like partisans or appear to act like partisans. And the Trump administration's strategy, and they're not strategic, I don't think the president's strategic about hardly anything, but he is strategic about this. It's one of the few things that he wants to portray the press as the opposition party. Bannon coined that phrase, and he has used it over and over and over again. So we have to be careful not to do that. Now, that's difficult when the president personally attacks you, when the president says things that are flat out false over and over again. You're there, you're responding, you're, correcting the mistruths, and it sounds like you're going toe to toe and opposing the president. And in some ways you are. It's true, but it's you've got to be even-handed, and that sometimes we get attacked for with this both sidesism. You're like, no, it's not both sidesism. It's fundamentally trying to get at the truth and doing it in a fair way and not a partisan way. It doesn't mean when the president says something that's false, that you don't say that's false and explain why it's false. But it means that you do so in a way that your only agenda is the truth. It's not defeating the president or wounding the president. It's getting at the truth and informing your viewers or your readers. That should be our North Star. And in this White House, it's difficult because doing that often puts you toe to toe, like I said, in opposition to the president.
I was going to say, one of the people that the president really, I don't know if went after is the right word, but he had a very tense relationship with Jim Acosta of CNN. I'm surprised you didn't interview him in your book, because you do refer to him a couple of times. Can you talk about why he stood out to you and other people?
Well, Jim Acosta, they tried to they took away his press pass. And I, in my position at the White House Correspondents Association, had to help lead the fight against the White House to get that press pass back. I remember sitting in the press secretary's office that the very next day, because this was right after the midterm elections. Acosta has an altercation with the president, a series of aggressive questions, the whole thing with the microphone, you all remember. And then he does his report, and then he leaves the White House. When he tries to come back in that night, they're like, no, your pass isn't invalid. So the next morning, I went in and met with Sarah Sanders and Bill Shine, who was the Deputy Chief of Staff for Communications, and the board of the WHCA. And I write in detail about this very frustrating meeting. It was like, this is a red line for us. You cannot do that. You cannot take away a reporter's pass because you don't like the questions he's asking, or you don't like the way he's asking the questions. You have a right not to call on him if you want. You have a right to criticize him. You do not have a right to ban him from this public space. And so I write about that, and I thought it was shameless what they did to Jim Acosta. I do offer some criticism of Jim as well, in a series of things he did that I thought played into that portrayal of us as the opposition party. But I have to say, Jim Acosta is a good reporter. He is a serious reporter, and any criticism that I have of him is incredibly minor compared to the actions that this White House took to try to silence him. And I would stand with Jim Acosta to defend his right to report on this White House and to defend him against some of the really atrocious attacks that have been directed at him, in some cases from people who work for the president, and in many cases from people who support the president.
Just want to stay on this topic of opposition parties for a little bit more time. So here locally, the Boston Globe newspaper was responsible for a "Not the Enemy" campaign, where they had basically a lot of news organizations go out there and, put out editorials claiming that the press is not the enemy. What do you think about things like that? Do you think that plays into the opposition party narrative, or
Well,
what?
it's difficult, and I think it can. But I also believe that when the president of the United States is saying effectively that a free press is an enemy of the people, and I have an entire chapter about this myself, looking at the history of that phrase and the real meaning of that phrase, that it's really alarming. And I went on, even though I go chapter and verse, we can't be the opposition party, everything else. But when he said that again, that crosses a line. And I went on our Sunday show this week and I said, I first of all, pointed out how ahistorical that was, how offensive it was. And I close it by saying a free press is not the enemy of the people. A free press is a big part of what makes America great, to use a phrase that he likes. It was really outrageous. So yeah, it makes me uneasy when reporters have to band together and act a little bit like activists, because we're not activists, we're truth tellers. There's a difference. But in that case, this was getting at something fundamental to really what a free press is all about. And I think probably warranted a response like that.
So I want to be respectful of your time. Do you want to, right now it's 2:41. How much time do you think?
I should probably head out in about 5 minutes because I got to go and file tonight. The work never stops, as you know.
Okay. Well, let me see if you have any questions. So we have one question here from Adam Sennett, our president of the SPJ Chapter in New England. He
Hello,
says,
Adam.
President Trump, hey Adam. He said President Trump has called journalists the enemy of the people. How is he and members of his administration, maybe Republicans in general, feel about reporters behind the scenes?
Well, it is fascinating, and you'll see some pretty stark examples of it in the book. How many times the president has personally and viciously and savagely attacked reporters, I mean, including me, in public, and then a few minutes later act like nothing else has happened. He called me at one point during these coronavirus task force briefings, a third-rate reporter. You're never gonna make it. You're a wise guy. And he launched into me. And then 5 minutes later, he called on me again at the very same press conference as if nothing had happened. Maggie Haberman, he loves to attack Maggie Haberman in the most vicious and unfair and just, I mean, he lies about her. Okay. And then he'll call her up. He'll, I mean, it's just the disconnect is largely, again, because this is to him a show, and the reporters are a big part of, his attack on the reporters is a big part of the storyline for him. He thinks his supporters really like it. Sometimes he gets genuinely angry at reporters. I'm not going to say it's all for show, but there's certainly an element of it that's for show. And as I mentioned before, he is more familiar with what Maggie Haberman writes than probably just about anybody except for her editors, or what, Jim Acosta is saying on CNN, because he watches, he pays attention. And by the way, when he walks into that press briefing room, he knows almost everybody in there, which is pretty remarkable because that's not always the case. President Obama, he knew some reporters, mostly the reporters that kind of irritated him, but he didn't know most of the people in that room. So Trump really pays attention. I remember when he first called on Yamiche Alcindor during a briefing a press conference in New York. I think it was in '98, in the fall of '98, at UNGA, the UN General Assembly. And he calls on her, and Yamisha's working for the NewsHour, but he remembers that she worked for the New York Times, and he brings that up. He's like, "You're with the New York Times," but I mean, like he like knows who the reporters are, who they worked for before, but they are not. I mean, it's so a lot of it is. I mean, one thing I say in the book is there's very few things more fake than the president's attack on fake news.
Do I have time for one more question? Is that okay?
Sure.
All right, so my last question for you would be the way you end this book. I mean, it ends a little optimistic, would you say? I mean, what you end up finding at the end of the book. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I had a real hard time figuring out how to end this book, and I was feeling pretty dark, actually, and I had gone and had this meeting with the president, and we were in the midst of impeachment, but I had this meeting that I described, this kind of surreal meeting, and one thing I said to him at that meeting was, keep in mind, we are not that long after the mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton. And I said to him, when you say enemy of the people, I'm really worried that at some point, one of your supporters may take your words to heart. Aren't you worried about that? Don't you think you have to be careful? And his answer was, well, I hope they do take my words to heart, because I really believe the fake news is the enemy of the people. He speaks very similarly off camera and on camera. And it was like he didn't grasp what I was saying. That no, I'm talking about somebody becoming unstable and killing journalists. I'm still worried about that. We all should be. And there was a disconnect. So I was trying to process that and process the way in which he has undermined the faith in a good chunk of our country in news, real news that strives to be objective. That there's like maybe 40% of the country, maybe it's a third of the country, but it's somewhere like that, that he has told, don't believe what you read in the newspaper. Don't believe what you see with your eyes. And they have taken that cue. And that's a problem. That's a challenge for us. To have such a big part of the country, a minority part of the country, but a significant part of the country that does not believe in fact-based journalism and believes it's all made up, believes that you go to work, Jordan, and you make shit up.
Right.
And it's insidious and it's awful. And it is, as I describe, it's a war on truth, essentially. And it's made worse by the fact that he has felt so comfortable in saying things that aren't true himself, and that people who work for him feel comfortable saying things that are flatly untrue. And that all of this kind of contributes to a real threat to, and I don't mean to sound overly dramatic, but I was really feeling a threat to our republic, because you need to have an agreement about basic facts if you're to work as a democracy. And if one part of the country won't believe anything that they see in a newspaper, and another part of the country feels they can't believe anything that comes out of the White House, how are we going to, how do you solve our problems? I mean, our whole system is based on trust. Everything about our system of government, we trust that when we cast a ballot, that our votes are going to be counted and counted accurately. We trust the people to elect political leaders. And we also trust ourselves to throw them out of office if they don't meet our expectations. We trust that we have a balance of power, that if the Congress goes off the rails, the courts can get them back on track. We trust that the dollar that we have, even though it's a piece of paper not backed by anything, we trust that it is worth something because it's backed by a government that ultimately we complain about and we have problems with, but we trust. So if you break that down, everything breaks down. But the reason why it ended on a note of optimism is I just as I became president of the White House Correspondents Association last year, I described this email I got from a staffer who worked for Sean Spicer and then for Sarah Sanders, saying that she had something that she thought belonged to the WHCA. And I went up to the press office and it was in a ratty old box behind a copier. And it was the founding charter of the White House Correspondents Association, signed in 1914 by 11 very imperfect journalists who worked for news organizations. Almost all of them, I think 9 out of the 11 are defunct. Not a diverse crowd, to say the least. But they started this organization and that we can now use to fight for journalists to have access and to fight for, you know, for what we believe is important for real journalists to be able to do our jobs. And the fact that, and this charter had gone missing, and I described, and you can look at it at the end, you know, this charter had been missing for, you know, for years, and we all thought it was gone. And here it was. I almost had tears in my eyes when I saw this thing. And I took it to the National Archives to get the archivist of the United States to look at it and to see if he would consider putting it on display at the archives. And so I went there off hours. The building was closed. And I met with the archivist. And he said, "You want to walk down into the rotunda?" And I walked through the rotunda of the archives. And it was a really moving experience to me. It's hard to really convey. I'm walking by the Bill of Rights, and there's the First Amendment, written by James Madison. And I know I've studied enough about James Madison and the First Amendment and all that, and about press in the early, in the early days of our republic, to know that there was no press like we recognized back then. The papers were all like extreme versions of, Fox News and MSNBC. I mean, they're all like, but really partisan. I mean, there wasn't an Associated Press or a New York Times or an ABC News. But there was the First Amendment, which its meaning has evolved and changed, but it has been, it is guaranteed we have the right to do our work. And then I see the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, written by somebody who owned slaves. And in a time when women didn't have the right to vote, because the Constitution's there. So the Constitution created this system. And again, create a system where women for, more than a century wouldn't have the right to vote, where 4 million Blacks were enslaved and didn't have any rights at all. But seeing all of that and realizing that, one, how far we've come, how these musty old documents have helped us, written by profoundly imperfect men, have helped us overcome much of that. And then I'm carrying my little, White House Correspondents Association charter, not as dramatic as any of those documents, but it just made me realize that we've been through some really bad times. We have made profound mistakes, and we've emerged, I think, and will emerge ultimately stronger, that more perfect union. Still far from perfection, but we have the tools to make it better.
I think that's a perfect ending. So Jonathan, Karl, I want to thank you again for your time today. I encourage everyone to go out there and read the book, Front Row at the Trump Show. It's right here. I think it's going to do wonders in terms of helping people navigate how to, if they ever go to the White House, how to work there. So thank you so much for that.
Hey, thanks I really enjoyed meeting you and spending some time talking to you. And give me a call when you come to Washington next.
I will do.
All right, take care.
Take care.